Homang, I'm Charlie Smith, Losai, editor, Georgia Straight Newspaper. I'm the editor of the Georgia Straight Newspaper, and I'm here to give the WOW TV audience a roundup of stories that we've been interested in watching this week in the news. And one of the biggest stories that emerged came out of the provincial government in Victoria, and it was a report by the Auditor General. The Auditor General is a person, an accountant, who's appointed by the legislature to watch spending. And one of the things he was looking at was dealing with climate change, global warming. And the BC government likes to tell people that it's carbon neutral, in that it doesn't emit any of the carbon dioxide that causes global warming, because whenever there's any government operation, whether it's a school, a hospital, a university, or a government building that may be emitting carbon dioxide that is creating global warming or contributing to it, that they offset that by planting trees or by doing something else to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in other areas. So the former Premier Gordon Campbell came up with this idea, and he created something called the Pacific Carbon Trust, which is a company actually owned by the government. It's called a Crown Corporation. So the Pacific Carbon Trust's job was to take money from public bodies, including school boards, and then use it to reduce carbon emissions somewhere else. So the school districts weren't happy with this, because they would be given a bill each year from the government to cover their pollution. And the problem, they said, was, well, that was money that they couldn't put into books and classrooms and children's education. And the same for hospitals, the same for other public bodies. But this was the policy because BC wanted to be an environmental leader. So Pacific Carbon Trust takes this money and then puts it into projects that are deemed to be environmentally suitable and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So one of them was a dark woods forest project in southeastern BC, which is home to grizzly bears and mountain caribou. Normally, this land would be logged, and when you cut down trees, the carbon emissions are reduced, are expended, and then there's more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that causes climate change, warmer temperatures, more storms. So they gave this organization that set aside this land massive amounts of money, millions of dollars, out of the public treasury to reduce carbon emissions. And they said, well, we're not going to cut the trees. And the government said, oh, that's great. Okay, you can take the money. There was another one in Canada which got $1.6 million because it said, it's a natural gas company, and it said, we're not going to flare the gas. And so, okay, you can take the money. So this was about 70% of the money was spent on these two projects, amounting to about $6 million. And then what happened was the Auditor General came in and he did a report, and he looked at it because he's the watchdog. He's the financial guy. And he said these projects would have happened anyway, even without the money. So he makes the argument that this money didn't need to be spent in this way, and it was basically a waste of money because these projects would have gone ahead anyway. And this has created a big controversy for the government. The government has criticized the report, and the people who are involved in the buying of the carbon offsets, they're called, are saying that he doesn't understand the business that they're in, and that he's caused all sorts of trouble with this report because there are accounting firms and other people who've looked at this. There have been questions raised about the research that he relied on, but he is sticking to his facts. The whole investigation was driven by an independent MLA named Bob Simpson, who's in Caribou North, who's very interested in this area. And it's also been criticized, this approach, by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And the basic point that the Auditor General said was, we should only be doing this if this project would not have gone ahead without the financial incentive. And he says in both of these cases, the projects would have gone ahead. He saw no evidence otherwise. So that was a fairly major story in British Columbia because it involved this expenditure of millions of dollars that the Auditor General said was not necessary. And it's not very good news for the BC Liberals as they're approaching a provincial election on May 14th. And in Canada, provincial elections are very important because we have a very decentralized federation in Canada. What that means is that the federal government doesn't have as much power as most national governments in the world. In Canada, the federal government has power over such things as broadcast licenses, fishing in saltwater, immigration, national defense, and it writes a lot of checks for pensions, checks to the provinces for health care and post-secondary education. But the provincial government is the really powerful force in Canada. The provincial government has control over most of the land and resources. Provincial government has jurisdiction over education, over health care, over social services, over natural resources, most of the natural resources. So as you can see, a provincial election can make a huge difference in people's lives. And the other thing is the provincial government and the federal government both charge tax. So you have your provincial tax, your federal tax. And the federal government is largely responsible for First Nations. So the Aboriginal people come under the control of the federal government, the jurisdiction. So the next story that I'm going to talk about involved a federal body, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP offer policing services in many municipalities in the Lower Mainland, large ones like Surrey, Richmond, Burnaby, Coquitlam, as well as many of the smaller ones. Well, the RCMP for many years relied on a psychologist named Mike Webster, and Mike Webster was a hostage negotiator, and he was very well regarded. But in recent years, he's become extremely critical of the RCMP, and many of his clients, his patients, are RCMP officers. So they come to him and they say, I'm feeling stressed, or I have a problem, or I have a psychological problem. And Mike Webster offers them counseling and expert advice, and they seek him basically to heal. Well, he's seen so many RCMP officers over the years, he's come to the conclusion that many of them are getting emotionally and psychologically sick as a result of the organization. So he's been saying the RCMP itself is a toxic organization, and it's making the members sick. And this has created a big problem with the RCMP because they don't want to keep sending their officers to Mike Webster, who's going to stand up in public and tell the public that the organization is making his patients sick. So they issued an order that they weren't going to cover the costs of any of their patients going to see Mike Webster, and he has continued to criticize the RCMP and the organization, and particularly the bosses, the people at the top. So what's happened as a result is the RCMP filed a complaint against Mike Webster. Psychologists are licensed by the College of Psychologists of British Columbia. So if you want to practice as a registered psychologist, you have to have a license. And you have to pass a test, and you have to have the credentials. And he's had this for many years. But any member of the public can file a complaint. So the RCMP filed a complaint against him because he'd been criticizing the RCMP and suggesting what he was doing was not professional. Well, what happened this week was the RCMP didn't get any satisfaction because the College of Psychologists rejected their complaint. And Mike Webster, we have an article here, and I think he was saying, just take a look here. This is his quote. He said, "The complaint was nothing more than dirty tricks." So Mike Webster is continuing to criticize the RCMP,